he was recorded as saying Northern Ireland is the price that Britain has to pay for Brexit.
Yeah,
An
but that's
absolutely
just factually
disgraceful
true.
comment. Well,
It
it was a
didn't make
disgraceful
any
comment
difference
and
that it's factually
very,
true.
well, no, absolutely, it isn't true. It was a disgraceful comment.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 183 for the 6th of November 2025. Iain Dale was a Conservative Party candidate in North Norfolk, presumably reported on by Alan Partridge, in the 2005 British general election, and he had a few other attempts to become an MP at Westminster, including in last year's election, but he was ultimately unsuccessful at that. But that electoral history would grossly understate Iain's participation and influence in politics. He's been involved in the Conservative Party at senior levels. He's written or edited more than 40 books on politics, and he's a star presenter on the British talk radio station LBC, and he's just published a book with Swift Press called The Taoiseach, A Century of Political Leadership, with essays on all of the Taoiseach up to today. And Iain joins me now. Iain, before you go to bed at night, do you bow down and offer sacrifices before the altar of the gods of politics to thank them from saving you from becoming part of the disaster that is the current Conservative Party in Britain?
Well, there is a bit of that. I mean, the only reason I stood or tried to stand in last year's general election was because I could see what was coming. And I thought, well, they're going to need a few wise old owls in there to try and get them out of the mess that they've got themselves into. And I thought I could contribute to the rebuilding process, but it all went terribly wrong when I announced that I was leaving my job at LBC. And this is like just a few days after the election was announced. Yeah. My local MP decided to stand down. So to cut a long story short, I thought, okay, well, I'll go for it. And I announced on the radio I was quitting my show after 16 years, the best job I've ever had. And then the next morning, I get a call from my putative campaign manager to say that they'd had a email from the local Liberal Democrats with a sound file of something I'd said on my podcast, which I used to do with the former Labour Home Secretary Jackie Smith, where I had basically slagged off the town that I wanted to stand in. And
not
said
I'd
rather live anywhere else. And I mean, it didn't take me a long time to work out that that would just be plastered over every Liberal leaflet and it would be a disaster. So I then decided not to go forward with it. And so I actually only had 3 days off the radio and they took me back and here I am.
That was pretty good. I'm presuming the Liberals won that seat in the election.
Well, because I was assured by the former MP that no, they hadn't got a chance of winning, and that if I stood, I would win. I was nationally known. I'd lived there for 25 years. What was not to like? And the Liberal Democrats won by 8,000 votes in the end. So I did save myself from 4 or 5 weeks of a horrible campaign. And as you say, possibly a few years of torture.
You were a Brexiteer. You supported Britain leaving the EU. Yeah. How's that getting on for you guys?
Well, I don't know what the Irish press says about it, but it hasn't been the utter disaster that was predicted. I mean, I remember interviewing our then Chancellor.
Your colleague James O'Brien on LBC has a question that he has asked probably enough times for him and me to know it by heart, which is name a few of the laws that are not possible within the EU that you would prefer to have.
Oh, that's such a tired old question. I mean, we're 10 years after the referendum now.
Do it's we really a tired question because he has asked it so many times, and he has asked it so many times because no Brexiteer has been able to answer it, surely.
Well, that's not really true. I mean, James and I have very different views on Brexit, always have had, but we coexist quite well on the same station, and we're quite friendly. I got very fed up during the referendum of the antagonism that there was between the two sides. I was never particularly in favour of having a referendum. I was never somebody who was advocating leaving the European Union. It was only at the last minute when David Cameron failed to bring back a deal from Brussels to renegotiate our terms of membership, that I thought, you know what, this is never going to end. The solution to every problem that Brussels has is more Europe. And I believe in nation states, and I certainly believe in nation states cooperating. But I didn't believe in a United States of Europe. And so I supported it on sovereignty grounds predominantly. Everyone says, "Oh, you must be anti-immigration to support Brexit." Not at all. In fact, I remember warning during the campaign, which I didn't take a side on during the actual campaign, but I remember saying to someone who called into my program, "If you think that immigration is going to be cut because of Brexit, you are delusional." And we all know what's happened since.
That might not be so well known in Ireland. Effectively, total net immigration has skyrocketed in Britain in the past 10 years.
Well, it really has. I mean, in
For good or ill, I mean, different people have different opinions on that, but the facts are of the numbers are that.
I am very pro-immigration. I think immigration has been great for Britain. It's most successful economies have large immigration. I mean, America is built on immigration.
Most successful shops are crowded. Yeah,
exactly. But you have to control it. You can't have open borders. No, don't think there's a country in the world that would say we should have open borders. But unfortunately, over the last 10 years, successive Conservative governments have failed to control immigration. They supposedly introduced a new Australia-style point system, but that hasn't really worked. And in 2023, we had a net income sort of input to the country of 1 million people. Well, that's a city almost the size of Birmingham. And it's fine having lots of immigration, but if you don't provide the infrastructures to cope with it, then you are riding for a fall. And unfortunately, voters, doesn't matter really whether you're on the left or the right, nobody trusts either the Conservative Party or now the Labour Party on immigration. And that's why you've got the rise of a party like Reform and Nigel Farage, because he's tapping into that. I won't say anti-immigrant feeling. I mean, there are obviously people who are anti-immigration, just as there are in Ireland. But it's people feeling that it's just got to a stage where it's too much.
In your book, which I have been reading, I was sort of impressed and wondering whether you were showing off that you mentioned the difference in spelling and pronunciation between Taoiseach and Taoiseach, the singular and the plural. And one of the reasons I was impressed is because, and maybe this is a little bit of national centrism, but it strikes me, and you might comment on this, that the British, both political and media elite, have an absolutely shocking level of ignorance and just complete failure to understand the country that is their nearest neighbour. And I'm not necessarily, all would include, the average person in the pub, but intelligent, educated people who are media savvy, the sort of people who know the difference between Kiev and Kyiv and why it's important, have just enormous gaps in knowledge and understanding about Ireland. A, would you agree? And B, why?
I totally agree with you. And that's why I've done the book. Because about 7 or 8 years ago, I was watching a RTE drama on Netflix about the Easter Rising. Now, in my slight ignorance, I assumed that it would be very anti-British because it was made by RTE. I mean, why you think, well, given that it's about the Easter Rising, why wouldn't it be? But it wasn't. And it was absolutely fascinating. And I learned more from that drama about what happened in those years than I have from any book. But then I thought to myself, well, what do I actually know about Ireland or Irish politics? I'd been to Dublin in 1994, was it 1995, to the Eurovision Song Contest. And that was the last time I'd been to Dublin. Really enjoyed it, but I hadn't been back since. I'd sort of followed Irish politics on the periphery. I sort of knew who all the main politicians were, but that was about the extent of it. I thought, well, why is this? Why don't I know more? Being a sort of, in Britain, I'm seen as sort of an ultra-political geek. I know a lot about American politics. I know very little about French politics. I know a lot about German politics because I speak fluent German and I lived there for a couple of years. But as you say, Ireland is our nearest neighbour. We've got all sorts of, it's not just the language we've got in common. I mean, I come to Dublin and for me, it could be an English city. It's very like where I grew up in Cambridge.
Don't say that out loud.
But I grew up at a time when obviously the Troubles were at their height. The news was dominated by what was going on in Northern Ireland. And I think for people of my generation, we always had this sort of sneaking thought that a lot of people in the Republic had some sympathy with what was being done, if essentially in their name. Now, I know now that thought was wrong. But that was, I think, and I think there are still people, a lot of people in Britain who would still harbour those thoughts. So we don't get taught in school about what happened in 1916 or 1922. We don't get taught anything about Ireland in British schools. So I think that's where it stems from.
Mm-hmm.
We don't really have many Irish television programmes shown on British channels. And if we do, they tend to be sort of Father Ted and stuff like that. I never remember seeing any serious documentaries about Irish history or Irish politics. Now, if you look hard enough, they're there, but you've got to want to look hard enough to find them. So I decided that I needed to educate myself. And so I started reading up a bit. And then I'd already done a book on British prime ministers in 2021, because it was the 300th anniversary of Sir Robert Walpole coming to power. So I did this book of...
He's considered the first prime minister in Britain.
Yeah, well, he wasn't called prime minister initially, but he was, by the end of his 21 years in office, he regarded it as an insult and didn't like being called the prime minister. And it's a bit similar, actually, to how the office of Taoiseach has developed in this country, where it's gone through several incarnations. And I mean, there was no office of Taoiseach when the Republic was first formed in 1922. It was there was an executive council, and there was somebody that was the head of the
council.
Yeah, exactly. And it was only in 1937, when the new constitution came in, that the office was formally created. And it was actually a very small office at the time. It's obviously expanded a lot since, for reasons we might go into later. So I'd done that book, and it was hugely successful. I mean, for a non-fiction political book in Britain to sell 50,000 copies in all different formats, I mean, was quite some achievement. So I thought, okay, what do I do next? So I did American presidents, then I did kings and queens, then I did dictators, and they all sort of were quite well received. I mean, I got a bit of criticism because they say, well, your name's on the front, but you haven't actually written the book. You've got other people to do the hard work for you, which is fair.
You have written some in your own right as well.
I do contribute to each one. I mean, I haven't in the Taoiseach one, but I have in most of the others. So then I thought, okay, well, what do I do next? And then I thought, well, what about Ireland? Let's look at doing that. I couldn't find a publisher. Nobody was interested. There was no Irish publisher interested either. And I discovered that there's no real tradition in Ireland of political autobiography or biography. Only two of the different Taoiseach have written autobiographies, I think. But it's very different. I mean, in Britain, it's almost like a constitutional duty for a prime minister to write their memoirs. So I didn't have much to go on. So I thought, well, okay, but if I can't do it as a book, let's do it as a podcast. So in 2023, I set about trying to find people who could do a podcast with me on each of the 16 Taoiseach, or 15, it was 15 at the time. So I found, over a period of a few weeks, I came up with various, I knew a few Irish journalists, Philip Ryan, who was then on The Independent. I published, when I was in the world of publishing, I published his biography with Neil O'Connor of Leo Varadkar. So I started with people I vaguely knew, and then they introduced me to other people. So I've got this collection of 16 people who are either journalists, politicians, historians, academics, each of whom have written an essay on the subject that they know best. Like, so Gary Murphy, for example, I mean, he's a total expert on Charlie Haughey, so he's written this doorstop of a book on him. So, I mean, if you go through some of the others, Martin Mansug, he had worked for Albert Reynolds, sadly died a few weeks ago, which I'm absolutely devastated by, because I've never met any of these contributors, bizarrely. I mean, it's all been done by email. And I was so looking forward to meeting him this week, because I'm in Dublin for the launch of the book on Tuesday. It was absolute tragedy. David McCullough just emailed me to say, I don't know if you know this, but Martin's died. And it was, even though I'd never met him, I actually got quite emotional about it.
Sorry to hear that. You have said before we started recording that obviously you've read all of these essays many times for editing them. Leaving the authors aside and looking at the Taoiseach, who do you like most? Who do you like least?
That's quite a difficult question, actually, because I mean, obviously they're all individual characters. Some of them, I mean, Charlie Hockey, I suppose I have to say, I find the most fascinating because he and Garrett Fitzgerald were the first two that I suppose as an adult really knew. I'd heard of Jack Lynch, but I didn't really know an awful lot about him.
I'm going to pin you down for an answer.
No, I will give you an answer. But I'm just explaining why I find Charles Hockey such a fascinating character, because I still can't quite comprehend that after the sort of 1970 gun running scandal that he was involved in, how he became Taoiseach within a decade of being involved in that. I mean, quite a political ability to come back from something like that. So I've always found him fascinating because he's like, there's this phrase that you hear a lot, well, maybe in Britain more than here, but sort of an Irish rogue. Yeah. Well, he is the classic Irish rogue. The one I think I like most, though, is probably Bertie Ahern, partly because he came across as a real human individual. I mean, some politicians don't come across as, I mean, they either have a reputation of being a little bit aloof, a little bit above the fray, whereas I thought he was somebody that people could relate to. He played an enormous role in the Anglo-Irish agreement, sorry, not the Anglo-Irish agreement, the peace process in 1998. And I remember, I think what did it for me was actually the story of when he was involved in the talks with Tony Blair, Mo Molan, David Trimble, Gerry Adams, Martin McGuinness at Hillsborough Castle, and got the news that his mother had died. And he, I think, left to go to her funeral, but immediately came back. And I thought, well, that is the mark of a good man. Now, again, he obviously had his financial issues and problems, and I think he could have been Taoiseach for a lot longer than he was had that not existed. But I've always had a real regard for him, and I was desperate for him to be able to come to the book launch on Tuesday, but he's unfortunately otherwise engaged. So I would say, of all the ones that have existed in my adult life, I think he's probably the one I would say I like. The one that, I mean, Charlie Hockey, I'm not going to say he was necessarily a bad Taoiseach, but as a Brit, I found him to be very anti-British. I mean, during the Falklands War, for example, and this comes out in Gary Murphy's chapter, when he tried to get the EEC, as it was then, to lift sanctions on Argentina just as the military action started. And Margaret Thatcher rightly never forgave him for that. And that their relationship sort of entered a deep freeze after that. And I think she'd actually quite liked him up to then. She quite liked sort of roguish men. And I think there was a bit of a sort of flirtatious relationship that they had established. But that completely finished after that. And so he was always seen as a bit anti-British. And Garrett Fitzgerald, on the other hand, was seen as a sort of great antidote to Hockey. And the fact that he and Margaret Thatcher thrashed out the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985, I think that was a massive achievement. And I think that was the sort of stepping stone to the peace process that came more than 10 years later. And if you think about it, the reason it was such an achievement was because it was only a year after the Brighton bomb. Yeah. And that could easily have wrecked everything. But in a way, I mean, people have written whole books on the whole, that period of Anglo-Irish relations. And I think Margaret Thatcher and Garrett Fitzgerald never had a particularly close relationship. I think she found him a bit aloof, diffident, not someone that you could banter with like she did with Ronald Reagan, for example. So they never had a particularly close relationship. But for Gareth Fitzgerald to really drive that Anglo-Irish agreement through and Margaret Thatcher
I should just say for listeners
ignore.
who don't remember that the Anglo-Irish Agreement was in 1984 or 85, has been seen as a stepping stone to the peace agreement, but was essentially
Yeah.
something that gave the Irish government some level of in British policy in Northern Ireland.
Yes, and it was hugely
and was ferociously opposed by the Unionist political community.
Yes, and all 18 Ulster Unionist MPs resigned their seats in protest at it, and several of Margaret Thatcher's closest allies in the Conservative Party resigned their ministerial government post because of it. So it was quite a courageous thing to do, I think, on both parties. And as I say,
taking up that theme, because I think that relationship, and you're in a good place to comment on it, the nexus of that relationship between Ireland and Britain is something that is A, very interesting, and B, poorly understood both in Britain and in Ireland from different points of view. And I think that Irish people, if only because of the overspill of British media, Irish people tend to be very well informed about British politics.
Yeah.
That makes it all the more shocking when, for example, senior newsreaders can't pronounce the name of the county that's right beside Dublin, and they make Meath rhyme with teeth rather than with seethe. And that might be annoying from media figures, but when you have somebody like your old boss, David Davis, giving wildly wrong statistics and figures and facts about Ireland in his negotiations over Brexit, and like literally stuff that would be better suited to be included in Darby O'Gill and the Little People than in international relations. And I'm mindful of specifically David Davis, because I know you worked for him, talking about the UK's internal border with Southern Ireland, and also British politicians quoting some zombie figure saying that only 100 trucks a day pass it and 50% of them are Guinness. The true figure is 13,000 and 1/3 of 1% of them are Guinness. And you know, anybody in politics or in media, and you will know, will have essentially what is a smell test for facts and figures that they are presented with, and will be able to kind of smell out things that are kind of obviously wrong. And the fact that people get that so wrong in Britain, but there has to be something there that explains why people are almost willing and anxious to believe things that are wildly wrong but fit a particular narrative.
I mean, at the risk of going back to Brexit, but let's do that. I think there was a complete failure of understanding of what the impact would be on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. It wasn't something that figured in my thoughts at all. I'll be completely honest about that. And I don't think there were many politicians that had given it any thought. And it was only comparatively late
there were
in the
in
referendum.
Ireland.
Well, maybe.
But this was absolutely a live topic of conversation in Ireland while that was happening.
I'm sure it was, but it just wasn't in the UK.
Yeah. But my question is why?
No, but among any politicians, it didn't matter which side. It was only really, I think, in the last couple of weeks that the Remain side highlighted on this. And I can remember having a furious row with a guest on my programme about, and looking back, I mean, I was completely in the wrong because I didn't understand the implications. And I'm thinking, well, I mean, I'm reasonably informed about politics, and I'm probably, I mean, this is going to sound boastful, but I'm probably in the top 5% of people who do understand something about
0.5%.
Thank you very much.
Don't be modest.
But if I didn't know about it, I wasn't particularly surprised that other people didn't. And it's been the thing that has, well, for about 5 or 6 or maybe even now, it's still bedeviling the whole debate about how Brexit either is working or isn't. Now, I think that I remember a speech that Leo Varadkar made in Belfast. Can't remember the year. It was probably 2017 or 2018. And I remember reading that speech and thinking, he gets it. He actually understands why Britain voted for Brexit, and he's willing to step outside the Brussels bubble and actually wants to come to a reasonable solution on this. Then that was the last time that he ever really did that. And I've always thought that. I mean,
Yeah,
in the end,
I'm interested in that
well,
comment.
let me just develop.
We'll finish
Let
and
me
then
just
yes, I'll come back
develop.
to it.
Let me just develop that point first, because I think it is important that, in the end, the Irish government had a decision to make. Did they want to come to a separate agreement with the UK on transborder trade, or were they going to effectively say, well, we'll actually cede this to Brussels? And I think they were under huge pressure to do the latter. And I don't blame them for doing that at all. I mean, if you're a member of the European community and that's what all the leaders have agreed, that's clearly the way they were going to go. I think it could have been different. And in the end, it delayed any real agreement, because it was only when Leo Varadkar met Boris Johnson on the Wirral, again, I'm the date I can't exactly remember,
Yeah.
that things actually started to move forward. And there was a lot of backchat between, I mean, I remember talking to David Davis about this, and Brandon Lewis, who's a very good friend of mine when he was Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. Mm-hmm. And he would tell me very much off the record about the back channels that he had, particularly with Simon Coveney. And they both felt that there was a really constructive relationship, even though publicly the Irish government was, in some ways, understandably quite antagonistic. But privately, behind the scenes, there was more of a constructive relationship. Now, it took a long time to come to any sort of arrangement, and even now, I mean, with the Windsor Protocol, I mean, there were all sorts of flaws in that, it seems. But I mean, at least we're in a position where it's kind of working, and that people aren't getting too exercised about it. But I'm not sure that it won't need to be reformed in the sort of medium term.
The thing with Leo Varadkar's speech, which you mention, is that what I think a lot of people in Ireland feel, and maybe it is an excessive or slightly narcissistic self-regard, but the feeling at the time, I know in Ireland, was that Ireland was in no way obliged to set itself on fire in order to keep Britain warm. This was an issue that was brought up and created by the British government, and you could say also the British electorate. Ireland didn't have any responsibility to resolve the problems that created, although clearly had an interest to making sure that they were resolved.
Well, quite.
And in particular, it is just not legally possible for Ireland to do a side deal with a UK or Britain outside of the EU. That's not how the EU works. And clearly, when Boris Johnson met Leo Varadkar in the Wirral, as you said, if Leo Varadkar goes back to the other EU leaders and says, proposes something which is likely to gain acceptance, they're going to be highly motivated to listen to him and to accept that. But that doesn't change the fact that this is that the negotiation was between Britain and the EU.
Yes, but I think we're in 2025. This was all going on 7 or 8 years ago.
Yeah.
And my memory of that time is of the Jean-Claude Juncker, who was the European Commission chief at the time, his chief of staff, Martin Selmayr, the so-called Beast of Berlaymont, because he was so influential in the whole administration, and he was recorded as saying, Northern Ireland is the price that Britain has to pay for Brexit.
Yeah, but that's just factually true.
Comment.
Well, it doesn't make any difference that it's factually true.
Well, no, absolutely, it isn't true. It was a disgraceful comment, and I think it hampered negotiations between Britain and the EU for many, many months after that.
It was possibly very impolitical.
He's admitted since then he should never have said it.
And I would say that's probably true, in that the comment was probably very unhelpful. But the fact that it's unhelpful doesn't take away from the fact that it's true, and that there is no squaring of the circle, that you need a border between the EU and Britain, and you need to not have an effective border either between Britain and Ireland.
There are different forms of border, aren't there? And when it gets to the point where one side of the negotiation...
Yeah, but a border is a border.
If you get to the ludicrous position where food products which have been approved in Britain under EU rules, which haven't changed, and they still haven't changed, and they're not being allowed into Northern Ireland with that ridiculous paperwork. There's no intention of them ever going into the Republic anyway. when you get to that point, you just think, well, nobody actually wants to have this deal because Britain has to be punished for Brexit. I mean, we have
Iain,
to
stick on that point, because that, I think, and I would be willing to admit that Ireland's self-regard can sometimes be somewhat narcissistic, but isn't that point, which was made so often, that the EU wants to punish Britain, just the ultimate in failure to understand the workings of the counterparty? Nobody, and you have, I know that you're well versed in German politics, nobody on the continent, in the political classes or in the general public, had the slightest interest in punishing Britain. Nobody cared. That was the real problem, was that nobody cared. There were a whole range of political issues and particularly economic issues that were created by Brexit. And there are standard international ways of treating third countries and countries inside a customs union or whatever, like the EU. And Britain decided to move from one camp to the other and thought that the effects of their decision were considered punishment.
This is a fundamental misunderstanding of why Britain left the European Union. It wasn't the British government that decided to do it. In fact, the British government didn't want to do it. David Cameron was campaigning for Remain.
Yep.
It was the British people that decided to do it. You have lots of referendums in Ireland. Nobody ever suggests that you should go against the decision of the Irish people in a referendum. I mean, that would be unconstitutional.
But there wasn't a decision. There was a decision against something. There wasn't a decision what to do in Brexit.
No, there was a decision. No, it was a decision to leave. That's a positive thing. You can say that you are right to one extent that there was no preparation done by the British government to prepare for what would happen if Britain voted to leave. I remember interviewing George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the week before the referendum. I asked him how many civil servants in the Treasury, the Finance Ministry, were working on what would happen if Britain voted to leave. And he said, none.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to him, well, you are not doing your job then. You have to prepare for every eventuality. And you're telling me that not a single civil servant is doing that. That is outrageous.
That's a reasonable point, but it's not a problem that either the EU or the Irish government has a responsibility to resolve.
I'm not saying there was a responsibility of the EU to resolve that, or indeed the Irish government. What I am saying, though, is that if you look at what's been written by the main protagonists involved in the negotiations since then, if you read Michel Barnier's diaries, he was the main EU negotiator. You read the book by his deputy, Stéphane Durinck. You look at all of the comments that the president of France made at the time. There was a desire to punish Britain. Now, I understand that. But to do as what you're suggesting is saying, oh, that's complete rubbish.
I think it's fair to say there was an exasperation and a lack of patience with Britain, but nobody was going to invest resources into doing Britain down.
Well, that's, again, simply untrue, because the documents would suggest that it's untrue. And I understand why. Because let's put it this way. Let's say that the EU decided, OK, well, look, Britain is obviously still an ally of all of our countries. We want friendly relations. We want to do a very, very brilliant trade deal. We're going to sort of do a lot of give and take. If they'd taken that attitude, what message would that have sent to some other countries that might have been thinking of leaving the EU? So I understand that they had to play hardball. Because they had to try and put off anybody else from doing the same thing. Now, I don't think there were any countries at the time that were thinking of doing the same thing, but even so, I can understand the principle of why they adopted a very, very hardline decision. Now, over the following sort of 3 or 4 years, I mean, at times that was chipped away, but to pretend that there wasn't the desire to make sure that no other country would follow Britain's lead, I think is not being realistic.
We are perhaps falling into the trap of exemplifying the problem rather than solving it. If you were to say, given that you don't have control over the history syllabus in Britain, and that's not something that's going to be at our disposal, but if you were to say, apart from your book, how could, in both directions, understanding be improved between Britain and Ireland, what would you recommend?
Well, I'd like to see the British media do much more on what's going on in Ireland. I mean, there was very little coverage of the presidential election, for example. I mean, it was the result was mentioned in most of the broadsheet newspapers. There was no real analysis as the campaign went on. Um, I mean, I try on my radio show to do if there's a big political event in Ireland, I'll get somebody in Dublin to come on to explain it. I'm not going to try and do it for them. Obviously, the last general election, I mean, we did a lot on that. From time to time, I'll do an hour long phone in with a couple of guests on what are the prospects for Irish reunification. And I mean that often does attract quite a lot of callers, and we do have a listenership actually in not just in Northern Ireland but the South as well. And I always, if I see somebody from the Republic on the switchboard, I always say to the producer, put them through first, because I always like it when I like it when I get calls from any country, not just Ireland, but I always like to hear the Irish perspective. So I think the media has a big responsibility here. I would like to see the Department of Education sort of include more about Irish history. I've often wondered, well, why don't they? Is there some sort of collective guilt complex in some way that permeates the British establishment here, where they don't want to teach about the famine? They don't want
That's a
to
reasonable
teach about.
reasonable question, and mostly I think this. I mean, my own instinct on this is I think it's mostly down to ignorance rather than malice. But then once in a while you see something like the very carefully phrased piece of history that is trotted out very often, that Lady Astor was the first female MP to take her seat in the Commons, and nobody who is phrasing it like that can fail to be aware that in fact Constance Markievicz was the first woman to be elected to the British Parliament. And, it's striking that those type of facts are sort of weaved around rather than included.
You will be delighted to know that the first book that I ever edited in this format, where you commission essays for people to write it, was a book called Honourable Ladies. And in fact, it was two books, 2 volumes of biographies of every woman that had been elected to the House of Commons since the First World War. And I'm trying to remember at the time whether even I knew that Nancy Astor wasn't the first woman to be elected. I think I probably did, to be fair to myself. But you are right that if you went up to most people in Britain and asked them that question, they would definitely say Nancy Astor.
And tell me, in terms of your own political involvement and career, not trying to centre this whole thing on Ireland, in the late 1980s, Private Eye reported that Matthew Parris, who was a very talented Conservative MP at the time, had left politics because he had been told privately by the higher-ups in the Conservative Party that he would never be made a minister because he was gay. Do you think that homophobia has been entirely eradicated from the Conservative Party?
Well, let's address the Matthew Parris thing. I mean, he's a good friend of mine. I don't believe that was the case. He actually left Parliament earlier than that because he got a job as the main political interviewer on ITV. So he did that big Sunday lunchtime political programme. I think he had worked out that he wasn't actually particularly suited to be an MP. Some people are, some people aren't. And he certainly had a brilliant career ever since. I mean, homophobia permeates all political parties, whether they're on the left or the right. Often the left-wing parties never really want to admit it. But you go into a working men's club in Newcastle upon Tyne, and I can assure you that there will be just as many sort of homophobic comments as there might be in the Carlton Club. I think I'm quite well qualified to talk about this because I was in 2003. I was the first Conservative candidate to be selected, having told in advance the selection committee that I was gay. And this was in North Norfolk, a very conservative area with a small c. And I got 2/3 of the vote on the first ballot. I was actually really proud of them for doing that because they could easily have not done it. I think there was a degree of homophobia in the campaign, but it was the Liberal Democrats that were perpetrating it. And their candidate apologised to me at the count for what had been said by one or two of his councillors. But we now have a parliament in the UK where I think I'm right in saying that 13% of the MPs in the current House of Commons are gay, openly gay. Now, there's probably quite a few that aren't openly gay, even in this day and age. We have a parliament where the minority people are slightly overrepresented. I mean, I can say this. You couldn't say this. Well, in fact, I don't even know what your sexuality is. I don't need to know. But I can say this. I think gay people are actually overrepresented in the British Parliament. Ethnic minority people are slightly overrepresented. But I mean, if we were having this conversation 20 years ago, neither of us would have thought that was possible. So I think that's come a long way. People get selected all the time now, having been open about their sexuality. I'm not saying that homophobia has been totally eradicated either from British society or indeed from political parties, but it's a fraction of what it used to be.
What's going to happen after the next British general election?
Well, if you can tell me, I'll go and put some money on it, because at the moment it is absolutely impossible to say. Now, most of your listeners probably will think, well, Keir Starmer's got a huge majority, 170 seats, so therefore he will be re-elected.
Yeah, but he got less votes than Jeremy Corbyn.
Exactly. And he was elected on 33.7% of the vote, which in a first past the post system is very little. But because we now have well, I think at the next election, it won't just be the normal Conservatives, Labour and the Liberal Democrats. We'll have Reform, we'll have the Green Party, and we'll have this new left-wing Jeremy Corbyn, your party. And in Scotland, of course, the SNP, and Wales, Plaid Cymru. So you've got 6 or 7 party politics. Now, you're used to that. You've got an electoral system that can cope with that.
Yeah, you preempted what I was going to come back at you with, because used to it or not, we have an electoral system to cope with it. Not only do you not have an electoral system to cope with that in the UK, the electoral system that you have is catastrophically capricious in that sort of a situation. And in case people don't follow this, you essentially have a Reform Party in the early 30% in the opinion polling, and 4 parties, Conservatives, Labour, Liberal Democrats and Greens, at roughly half of that, more or less equal. And that means that you will have wildly unpredictable results and people being elected with very, very small amounts of the vote, and very likely people being elected who a large majority of the people in their constituency firmly oppose. That is, in the day and age we're in, that puts democracy in peril, doesn't it?
You could look at it that way. I mean, I find it very difficult to predict what will happen, because the worst case scenario is that the electorate believes the Conservatives failed over 14 years generally, and they did, and I say that as a Conservative. If Labour don't deliver on their top 3 or 4 manifesto promises, i.e. to curb the small boats coming across the Channel, to solve the cost of living crisis, to improve the National Health Service, if they fail on all of those, then you've got a large group of people, and it will be partly the 3 million people that voted for the first time in Brexit because they thought they were able to influence something. Nigel Farage will be able to motivate those people again, because they'll vote as being anti the 2 main parties. So let's say Nigel Farage becomes Prime Minister after the next election. I'm not predicting that will happen, but it is now a possibility. And say he fails. Because basically, if you said to me, Ian, can you tell me who Nigel Farage's main allies are and who would be the Home Secretary, who would be the Chancellor, who would be the Foreign Secretary, I couldn't give you names. And the names that I could give you would be an absolute disaster. Mm-hmm. So let's say Nigel Farage fails as Prime Minister as well. Well, then we really are in a doom loop, because people either will just give up voting or they will go to extremes. And I don't believe Nigel Farage is an extreme. There are far more extremes than him. And that I really fear for the future of democracy in those circumstances. So we're not used to having all of these parties in Britain, and our electoral system is not designed to cope with that. Now, it may be that after the next election, because results in individual constituencies will be so unpredictable, you could have, in theory, a Conservative government being elected with a small majority on 23% of the vote. Now, that is not sustainable in the long term. You might be able to say, yeah, well, we've got more seats than anybody else. But I mean, that's a pretty shallow victory, even shallower than Keir Starmer's has been this time. So the whole argument about, well, should we change the electoral system, that is going to get skyrockets under it over the next few years, I think.
What do you think about that argument?
I've always been against proportional representation for Westminster elections because it's very difficult to maintain the same kind of constituency link. But I'm happy for it to be...
Go back. Difficult to do what exactly?
Difficult to maintain the constituency link. Now, depending on the proportional representation system you use, you obviously still have constituency members of parliament. I mean, you have here. In Germany, it's you have and in the Scottish Parliament and Welsh Parliament, they're elected on a list system.
Yeah, so it's a split. Some MPs are from a list, some are from constituencies.
So, I mean, there are all sorts of different ways of carving this out. But for example, when we were in the EU and we'd have European elections, there was a southeast constituency which stretched from Dover to Oxford. And there was like 10 different MEPs in that area. No one knew who they were. And I think that's the thing that you've got to guard against. Whereas at the moment, each constituency has 80,000 voters and people know who their individual MP is.
Yeah, Irish people like to be superior about the SDV system that we have, perhaps forgetting that it was insisted on by the withdrawing British in order to protect the electoral interests of unionists in the south of Ireland, which is remarkable to say the least. It would not be a bad system to introduce in Britain to A, have stability, and B, have some sort of keep what you call the constituency link, and also have some sort of link between the votes cast and the actual people elected, which is weak at the moment and may get weaker.
Well, you say that it would bring stability, and on the surface you're right. But do I want the kind of stability where the same two parties carve out a coalition with each other, with an odd minor party coming in from time to time, and effectively becoming a uni party? I mean, if I said to you...
Yeah, if the voters vote for that.
Tell me the real difference between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. Well, there are clearly differences. But I mean, they would both be considered sort of vaguely centre-right parties. There's no real alternative. There hasn't been until fairly recently. And I wonder if your system is actually as stable as it has been over the last decades. Because
if somebody is sufficiently firebrand and can get up at whatever pulpit and say that democracy is not the right system because look at this, it has no connection between the vote and who rules you, and if that is true, then that is where your instability comes from.
Absolutely. And look, I'm not sitting here being ideological about a voting system. As I said, local government, regional government, I'm not against it. And I am re-examining my views on whether there is a form of PR that could be used in national parliaments. But I mean, Disraeli once said, England does not love coalitions. And although the Cameron-led Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition between 2010 and 2015, I mean, I actually think was a very successful government in many ways. And it allowed the smaller party to actually implement 75% of its manifesto promises, which I'm not sure that all coalitions lead to that. I worry that if there are 7 or 8 parties and the electorate is going to become even more hacked off with politicians because they're not going to come to some sort of coalition agreement before an election, so that they'll spend weeks possibly after an election like they do in Belgium. Although having said that, in Belgium, they went without a government for 9 months while the coalition was
more. I think it was a year and a half.
Was it? Well, anyway, the economy boomed in that time, so draw your own conclusions.
The anarchists might draw support from that. But in any case, Iain Dale, broadcaster, publisher, author of Taoiseach, A Century of Political Leadership, published by Swift Press, and an occasional politician. Thank you very much for talking to me.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
Kevin, I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'm being unrealistic and I know, pretty much every country has a sort of a narcissistic sense of self-importance, but am I expecting too much to expect British politico types, journalists, politicians to know a little bit more about Ireland?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think we can expect British politicos to know as much about Ireland as Irish people are expected to know about Britain, because it's so much bigger than we are. And, BBC is broadcast into Irish homes, and it doesn't go the other way.
Yeah, you wouldn't expect it to be completely symmetric, but like the point that I made to Iain, that British politicians and journalists who know the difference between Kiev and Kyiv and why that's important, but they then talk about counties like Meath and Westmeath.
Yeah.
Iain does seem to be a bit of an exception there.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, especially with, Northern Ireland is just, looms so large in our foreign policy. I always feel that Britain concerns itself with how it is on a much bigger stage. There's possibly a bit of narcissism on our part, maybe a bit on theirs as well, as they are no longer running an empire. Yeah.
Yeah. The one thing I didn't bring up, because I didn't have it to hand, bring up with Iain, was Karen Bradley or Karen Bradshaw, the former but 3 or 4 Northern Ireland Secretary, that's to say member of the British Cabinet responsible for Northern Ireland, who arrived in Northern Ireland on the job, unaware that nationalists only voted for nationalist parties and unionists voted for unionist parties, and just wasn't aware that that political divide existed. Yeah. That seems astonishing, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is. Especially for someone, I suppose, that in government. I don't know if your question extends, if that's the kind of people you have in mind, or whether.
Yeah, no, it is absolutely.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, then in that case, then yes, I'll say straightforwardly that I think that is strange, and they should do better.
Yeah, and I was thinking that Iain was doing pretty well, and then I was chatting with him after the interview, and hope he doesn't mind me including this clip, but we had this exchange. He's best known for being deeply involved in the GAA, and from...
What's that?
You're seriously not asking that question. The GAA's Gaelic Athletic Association is... It is the organising body of Gaelic football, hurling.
It was strange to me that that's what he said, because I know he's been introduced to the GAA through his work on Taoiseach. So it just must have just gone completely out of his head.
And it is notable, like such a gigantic cultural institution in Ireland that doesn't have any purchase at all. I can't, suggest he is out of kilter with British culture, because it has just no purchase in Britain, which is strange. But there we go. Go to the website for sources and references from the show. And while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on X, Twitter, @Here's How Podcast, and follow Iain Dale @Iain Dale, Iain spelt with 2 I's, and get in touch with us if you want to suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. I'm following up some of those suggestions from the last time already. Thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. It covers the cost of keeping the podcast going, the hosting and the phone bills. And if you could throw in a couple of euro once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here's how. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All of that is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The co-producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.